Good morning, everybody. Could I please invite you to take your seats? I hope you all... There's two microphones working here. I hope we can take off one. Yes, excellent. I hope you all enjoyed the day yesterday. The reception certainly was very lively. It wasn't always easy to hear the people that were speaking in front, but maybe at a reception that's always a challenge. But it sounded and it looks like it was a crowd of people very happy and excited after that first day to be together, to talk to each other. And that's, of course, exactly why we are so happy that you're all here. It's about the content, but it's also very much about partnerships, as Crystal outlined yesterday. So welcome to the second day, in person and also online. We're very, very pleased to be here in Brussels. There's a specific reason why we are so happy to be here in Brussels. We outlined this briefly yesterday. Brussels really is the capital of European legislation. And I had the personal experience of doing that for a couple of years. And so the process of crafting European legislation that binds 27 member states at the same time and also creates the frameworks for one of the largest consumer markets in the world is incredibly important. And so that's also why I'm super, super happy that we are here today in this session to speak about one particular part of that legislation that is affecting us all. It's very fitting to dedicate special attention to the EU Deforestation Regulation, which enters into force this week, if I'm not mistaken. So first of all, let me congratulate the European Commission and the European Parliament sitting next to the Commission for passing this piece of legislation. And in those representing the Council here in this room, let me congratulate the Council as well, because those three institutions are jointly instrumental in passing these regulations. It will change how markets function and how companies assess the risks of deforestation in their supply chains. Therefore, we want to start the panel today with a presentation by Astrid Schomaker of the European Commission's Director General for the Environment. She will provide an overview over how the EUDR fits into the overall policy framework of the EU, how it will contribute to the overarching goals of the EU relating to climate change and forest. And after Astrid's presentation, we will have a discussion focusing on, now that we've said we're going to do this, how are we going to make sure that this is a big success? What needs to happen before the EUDR is implemented by the end of 2024, early 25? We also want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience. And there's a special app to do this, the Slido app. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I already saw in some of the discussions that were taking place even before we got started officially that you have questions, suggestions. So please make sure to enter all of those in the Slido app so that we can come back to you on those later on. A few notes on housekeeping. We have interpretation available in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and English. And some of the panelists will also speak in Spanish or French. Please make sure to have your smartphone and headset ready to listen to the interpretation if needed. And we'll let you know how to submit your questions through Slido if you need a further introduction to that. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our keynote speaker, Mrs. Astrid Schomaker. She has been the Director for Green Diplomacy and Multilateralism at the European Commission's Director General for the Environment since 2016. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Astrid, that you came to the European Commission already in 1992. And you've had a long career within the Commission, basically traveling across the world from Washington to Japan in different roles, and now here in this incredibly important position. She studied English, history, and law in Hamburg, Norwich, and Brussels. Astrid, without further ado, I'd love to give you the floor, please. You're welcome.
Thank you, and good morning. This is one of these things where it's difficult to see you, but I see there are quite a few of you, so it's really great that you survived the first day and you're still interested in the deforestation regulation, which indeed will enter into force tomorrow. So it's an exciting day for us. The day after, we will have our next multi-stakeholder platform, which is the body we use to engage with as many stakeholders in third countries at the same time as possible. So Anyway, the important thing is entry into force and entry into application, two different things. Let me start on that. Entry into application is in 18 months, so at the end of 2024, this is when the rules really start kicking in. So we have an 18 months now ahead of us to prepare for this regulation's effective implementation. So yeah, starting with the policy rationale, I think you probably are all aware, and we've discussed this yesterday, how deforestation contributes to climate change. I don't think I need to go into that. Often overlooked also that forests, of course, harbor a huge amount of biodiversity, primary forests in particular, and equally important and also not always mentioned in the same context that, of course, also they provide livelihoods for billions of people. And those are healthy forests that provide these ecosystem services, that provide us medicines, but that also help protect often the poorest against the effects of climate change, against landslides and the others. So there's a whole range of issues why it is so important that we do more to protect our forests. And in the European Union, we've been working on that for many, many years. In fact, since the early years of this millennium, when we started with our forest law enforcement, governance, and trade policy, at the time identifying illegal logging as the main threat to the forest. In fact, at that time, that was the main threat to our forests. And putting in motion a whole set of policies, the EU Timber Regulation in particular, the voluntary partnership agreements that we negotiated with a number of countries to address this issue of illegal logging and to strengthen forest governance. And all alongside this past 20 years, of course, we have seen forest loss continue and even accelerate. So we've seen also then lots of commitments from the private sector, more than welcome, consumer goods forum and others, zero deforestation, free supply chains. We've seen certification systems established and kick in. We have seen government commitments, of course, SDG 15, the probably most important global commitment to halt deforestation by 2020. And then reaffirmed but pushed back to 2030 in a way by the Glasgow Declaration on Forests, which speaks about stopping forest loss and actually reversing it by 2030. So commitments abound, and yet what happened yesterday, we saw the latest forest figures released here in this room, and what happened between 21 and 22, another increase. So it is amazing. So voluntary action, so much is going on, and yet we see continued forest loss. So from our side in the European Union, we felt that, well, it was okay to say that in the EU, we have not so much deforestation. In fact, we don't have deforestation. We deforested many, many decades ago. Now we have an issue of forest degradation that is linked to climate change. Our forests are not necessarily adapted to the new climatic conditions we're very actively experiencing here in Brussels these past weeks. But also there's an issue of very intensive forest management that has contributed to the degradation of our forests. So when we started drafting our legislation, we decided to look at both deforestation and forest degradation to also capture the issues we're facing in the European Union, and also because forest degradation itself makes the forests be less capable carbon sinks, if you so want, but also forest degradation tends to be a precursor to deforestation. So we wanted to capture both of these things, and while we're talking about a deforestation regulation, it's in fact deforestation and forest degradation. Now, also important, this regulation has attracted an enormous amount of attention around the world, both positive and negative, and both with equal sort of strength and energy. There has been a lot of pushback against the regulation from many producer countries. Often, I will say, I think based on a misunderstanding, probably propagated by vested interests. So there was often talk about the EU is now banning palm oil or whatever. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I come to that in a moment. So, but also concerns that the EU is sort of stepping into the legal systems of third countries and in a way imposing our views on what they're doing, on what third countries are doing. And again, this is not what this regulation is about. But I think we also have to recognize, and it brings me back to what I said in the beginning, all these efforts that are being made in third countries as well haven't really yielded the results we wanted them to yield, even if in many countries we also see good results, like yesterday Indonesia and Malaysia, we saw this very impressive decrease in deforestation. But around the world, and it is fair to say that they have not resulted in what they should have resulted in. And from our perspective, this is also that as long as there is demand for a commodity, this commodity will be produced. That's simply a fact of life in modern economics. If there is a demand, somebody will come and produce, no matter what it is. If it's a piece of wood, if it's palm oil, if it's soy, or if it's a product or a cigarette or what have you. So we thought we need to address our demand because that's our side of the story. This is how we actually, in the European Union, contribute to deforestation in third countries. And the way we want to do it is essentially about transparency in the supply chains. And here, I think it's also important to note that the Deforestation Regulation is part of a broader set of measures that we believe will, in fact, lead or have already kicked off a market revolution. And with this revolution, I mean a really transformative change to the way supply chains, supply chains function and how we see more transparent supply chains in the future, not just for forest commodities, but around the world. We are also looking at our product legislation. Some of you may be familiar with the sustainable eco-design for sustainable product legislation that is being discussed. Some of you will have heard about a proposal that is being discussed between the co-legislators. That is our Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive. There is also a relatively new proposal came earlier this year related to forced labor. And they all have one thing in common. They're about the transparency of the supply chain. They're about enabling the consumer to know what he or she, what impact he or she has through his or her consumption, but also very importantly, while it's not just the consumers, it is also the financial sector that will have much more information about whether an operation they're asked to finance is sustainable and also in the long term viable. In other words, is it a good investment? So we see also the financial sector move towards more greenness and wanting to do more in that sector. And of course, there are also green finance rules that help us there. But I mean, sooner or later, and we think sooner, it will become clear to the financial sector that operations that are not sustainable are also not financially viable anymore because the customers will turn away from them. So while we do not have specific rules for the financial sector in the regulation, we still believe that this regulation will have an impact also there and coming together with all these other transparency instruments that I have mentioned. And that also means, from our perspective, that the market for sustainable products will continue to grow. Thank you. And that means that the regulation will therefore also open greater opportunities for companies that offer deforestation-free products. That's maybe a bit too close, sorry. Now, I would like to nonetheless, I think some of you may know, but maybe not all, and there are so many fake news about the regulation. I just want to run a bit quickly through the main elements of the regulation. I've already said it's all about traceability and transparency in the supply chain. So what I want to say about the regulation is, first of all, it addresses all forms of deforestation driven by agricultural expansion linked to the commodities in scope. Now, yesterday I messed them up, so I hope today I get the 7 together, otherwise Kai will step in. So it is palm oil, soy, coffee, cocoa, beef, rubber, and coffee, I've said? Wood, yeah, of course, sorry, yeah. How could I forget this? This is the one, of course, we're building our regulation on. Our EU timber regulation was the one we looked at first, of which we did a fitness check and from which we drew many conclusions that have influenced the proposal we then made for the deforestation regulation. Secondly, and as I just said, building on the experience we had from the EU timber regulation, the regulation will be based on mandatory due diligence rules for operators that place commodities and their derived products on the EU market or export from it. So it is not just about tropical deforestation, it's not just about imports, it's also about commodities produced in the EU or exported from it, but it is due diligence. Many questions always about due diligence, companies wanting to know how do I do it, basically would like a checklist, yes, no, done, done, done. This is not what due diligence is. Due diligence is taking responsibility as an operator, doing a risk assessment, doing risk mitigation, confirming that in their best assessment and based on this well-done due diligence, they believe what they put on the market is deforestation-free. Now, what does deforestation-free mean in the regulation? It means it was not produced on land that was deforested after the 31st of December 2020. That is our so-called cutoff date. We chose that date because that is the date by which countries around the world in the SDGs, SDG 15.2, I mentioned it earlier, committed to halt deforestation. So essentially, that is the moment when actually no deforestation should have happened. It also needs to be, the commodities also need to be produced legally, and legally means in line with the relevant legislation, of course, in the country of production. Then, as I said, key features, strict traceability linking the commodity to the plot of land where it was produced. Sounds difficult. I think the discussions at this summit have proven and will continue to show there is a host of tools available, and the challenge is to roll them out and inform everybody that these tools are there and how they can be used. But it is crucial for the functioning of this regulation that we can, in fact, link the commodities back to the plot of land where they have been produced, to make sure that this plot of land was not one that was subject to conversion of forest to agriculture. The due diligence rules are linked with a benchmarking system, and that is at the moment, I think, probably the one that's most hotly debated. This is a concept by which the European Commission will come out with a proposal, putting countries in 3 categories. Everybody is at the outset, so tomorrow when the regulation kicks in, standard risk, but we believe there are some countries that are low risk and other countries that are high risk. Now, what does that mean in practice? The due diligence for standard risk and high risk countries is the same, but if an operator chooses to source from a high risk country, and it is important to stress this remains possible, we're not banning any country or any part of a country. So if an operator chooses to source from such a country, due diligence needs to be done, but the rate of inspections that this operator faces from the competent authorities of the member states will be higher than if sourced from a standard risk country. And if an operator were to source from a low risk country, then in fact, we are looking also at a process of simplified due diligence. So basically just the collection of information, not the whole risk assessment process, and an even lower percentage of inspections. Yeah, I think those are the key features that I wanted to nonetheless highlight, to bear in mind also as we link the regulation with the discussions at this summit, with the data availability and the importance of such data and who needs the data, because there's a whole range of people that need it. Of course, operators will want to know, competent authorities will be looking very closely at the maps, for example, that have come out yesterday, and of course at other maps and other information that is around there. Our Joint Research Center is also trying to put together a global forest observatory. There is the FAO reports. So there is this range of information that competent authorities and operators will look at when they make their sourcing decisions. So that's grosso modo the regulation. If I have 2 more minutes, I just want to say a little bit about the implementation of the regulation that is ahead, because there as well, there are some essential features to be borne in mind. We believe, while the regulation is certainly innovative, it is also, we think, realistic in terms of starting with just 7 commodities and some derived products. But we have said it should have a progressive scope, so that product range is being reviewed regularly to see if new commodities should be covered, but also if perhaps new ecosystems should be covered. So we don't see a displacement effect, so that forests keep standing but peatlands are destroyed. So that would of course also not be what the regulation would like to achieve. So we have quite a few review clauses in the regulation. The first calls on us to do a first assessment even before the regulation starts applying. So within 1 year of entry into force, again, entry into force tomorrow, within 1 year, we will have to produce our first review, looking at the possibility to include also something called other wooded land. That is another term used by the FAO. A second assessment, 2 years after entry into force, will then review the list of commodities and products, as well as the possibility to look at other ecosystems, as I've already mentioned, and importantly, also the possibility to look at including specific rules for financial institutions. So we will have a couple of years to see how the market reacts, how the other sort of sustainable finance rules that are out there and the various efforts that are now also kicked off by the Global Biodiversity Framework, whether they have produced results and enough results, or whether more specific rules are necessary as well. Well, to sum up, this is all about encouraging a global transition to agricultural production that is more sustainable. I think this is precisely what this Carbon and Land and Carbon Lab Summit is all about. We want to do it in such a way that everybody can reap the benefits, so also smallholders. That means we have all along had a specific eye and paid specific attention to the situation of smallholders. Therefore, the regulation has in my understanding, a unique feature in European regulation. That is, it has a specific article dedicated to cooperation with third countries, where the EU says that we, in fact, commit ourselves to reach out and engage with third countries around the world that are producing these commodities to see how are their production systems structured, how can we help with this sort of transparency rules that we have put in place. And this is something that has, I would say, happened around the world. Our delegations are quite active. We see increasingly third countries, of course, engaged in our multi-stakeholder platform that I have already mentioned, but also coming to visit us. I had a very high-profile visit from Indonesia and Malaysia a couple of weeks ago. Right now, the Director General for Environment is in Indonesia and Malaysia trying to respond to the demands to set up task forces to look into more detail into the issues in those countries, into the existing certification systems, to what extent they can be helpful, how they can be strengthened, etc., etc. But we see a lot of momentum, and that was also what Stintje was saying in her introduction, around this regulation. A lot of good work done by stakeholder communities, by producers, by companies around the world. So it's really now our big task for the next 18 months to put all this energy together, make sure that it is directed, let's say, to the most vulnerable and the most complex supply chains, that we are aware of what are the geospatial monitoring tools that are available, how can we make them accessible for those that need them. All that, and hereby I just echo what was said a couple of times yesterday, this is all about partnerships, about close cooperation with partner countries. Incidentally, and that will be my last word, partner countries are not just producer countries. Partner countries are also consumer countries, the rest of the world. Because what is really important is that this revolution we're trying to kick off actually becomes a global revolution, and that other countries follow suit and do not just sort of say, well, we don't care, we buy the rest of the production and we maybe sort of put a price squeeze on it and buy it cheaper, but we don't care what's put in our market. So we are engaging a lot with the US, with China, with Canada, with Japan, trying to talk to them, seeing how their rules develop. I think it's fair to say everybody's interested, but I would say also everybody's sitting a bit on the fence and sort of saying, let's see what Europe is doing and how they survive and how it works. But it will work. And then I think the Brussels effect that people sometimes talk about will also be the effect that this regulation has, and this will become a global way of producing and a global standard. So transformative action needs global cooperation or collective action. This is why we're here, and we look forward to an interesting discussion in the next hour or so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid, for this wonderful, wonderful introduction to our discussion today. Global transformation, transformative action needs global cooperation. And I think with everybody here in this room, I'm sure we all want to partner, right? To see how we can make this a success, not for Europe, but for the world, for all of us individually. It's our home that we are discussing today. And we're going to have a real discussion now. So let me please welcome to the stage and give them a warm round of applause, Christina Gorlewski, President of the Paraguayan Forest Institute, Daniel Candy, Director of Sustainable Landscapes of the US State Department, Carplin Chirel, advisor to member of the European Parliament, Pascal Canfin, who was very intimately involved in all the negotiations. I'll take this first chair, and for the rest, seating is free. And Mr. Sheikh Tidiane Sia from the Ministry of Forest and Water of the Côte d'Ivoire. For a warm welcome to you all. So let me put this microphone away to avoid having double counting. Good morning, good to see you all. Try to shift my chair a little bit so that I can also see you. I'm going to ask all of you a few questions. If any of you would like to respond to something that a previous speaker has said, please raise your hand. Let's try to make this a real discussion. Christina, let's start with you. This regulation is, of course, a moment in time. It's a moment in time for both the European regulation, as was just outlined. This builds on previous pieces of regulation and discussions that have been ongoing for a long time. And you also outlined to me, when we just met briefly before this session, how this is also something which has been on the mind of Paraguay for a very long time, and how you have been working in this for a very long time. But can you tell me a little bit about what was the state of data, actually, on forest loss in Paraguay? And what can we learn from existing work on forest monitoring and efforts to decouple soy and beef production from forest loss? But first of all, I'd love you to give a brief introduction of how does this fit into the Paraguayan context? How does this fit into your own situation and how you are pushing to protect your beautiful country? Please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to speak in Spanish because a lot of people in Paraguay is watching this panel, so I'm going to wait a little time to you put your headphones for the translation.
Would you like a bit of water in the tea? Yes? Would you like sparkling or still? Yeah?
All set. Muy buenos días a todos.
I'm unable to serve you from here, but please, if you would like some water, go ahead.
Bueno, antes que nada, quería empezar diciendo un poco y recordando el Acuerdo de París, en donde todos los países tenemos responsabilidades compartidas, pero diferenciadas. Y este proceso de Paraguay de empezar a generar datos comienza en el año 2018. Yo asumo la presidencia del Infona en agosto del 2018 y me di cuenta que uno de los grandes desafíos que teníamos era la falta de información confiable, la falta de información estandarizada, incluso la falta de información científica, hecha con metodología científica. Entonces iniciamos un proceso de generación de esa información. Una de las primeras acciones que hicimos fue firmar un agreement con la World Resource Institute, con su director de ese entonces, Felipe Calderón, que fue a Paraguay para la firma de ese acuerdo. Y empezamos a generar información, empezamos a hacer partnerships con organizaciones, con el sector privado, con la sociedad civil, comunidades indígenas y sector público entre nosotros mismos, ¿verdad? Porque a veces el sector público no trabaja en conjunto. Empezamos a trabajar con todos, porque yo creo que esa es la clave del trabajo que estamos haciendo hoy en Paraguay. Llamar a todos los sectores de la sociedad, el sector público, el sector privado, la sociedad civil, comunidades indígenas, la academia, y empezar a construir datos para construir políticas públicas reales. No políticas públicas de documentos, sino que políticas públicas que puedan ser bajadas a terreno y que puedan ser realmente implementadas. En septiembre del año pasado lanzamos un histórico reporte de cambio de uso de la tierra y cobertura forestal de Paraguay. Es un reporte con más de 20 años de información sobre cambio de uso de la tierra y cobertura forestal en Paraguay. Está en nuestro website del Infona. Es un documento oficial del gobierno y es uno de los documentos que me siento más orgullosa de mi administración. Hay todo un equipo detrás, incluso que está aquí presente hoy, que trabajó en ese reporte. Y es un reporte histórico, una deuda histórica con los bosques de Paraguay, que fue saldado con este reporte. Hoy lo tenemos actualizado al año 2022. Y con toda esa información, fue muy emocionante porque al tener toda esa información en la mano dijimos, ok, ¿qué hacemos ahora? Y estamos en la década de la restauración. Entonces dijimos, hagamos el primer Plan Nacional de Restauración de Paraguay. Y fue una decisión nuestra, fue una decisión de Paraguay, empezar a trabajar. Hoy estamos finalizando la construcción del primer Plan Nacional de Restauración Forestal, en donde participan más de 100 personas, representantes de todos los sectores de la sociedad de Paraguay, porque hay que entender también el contexto paraguayo. Paraguay, el 40% de la superficie de Paraguay es bosque nativo. Y el 80% de los dueños de esa propiedad son del sector privado. Entonces, en Paraguay, los que protegen los bosques, o la mayor cantidad de los bosques, son los del sector privado y son los productores de alimentos. Paraguay tiene 8 millones de habitantes y produce alimentos para más de 80 millones de personas. Y son esos productores los que hoy están protegiendo los bosques en Paraguay. Este Plan Nacional de Restauración lo vamos a lanzar, si todo sale bien y llegamos a tiempo, en agosto de este año, y directamente queremos empezar a trabajar en el plan de acción en septiembre, octubre, porque somos muy conscientes que si bien Paraguay tiene un gran porcentaje de cobertura forestal, tenemos que trabajar en la restauración de nuestros bosques nativos. Este plan nacional tiene un objetivo general que fue una idea muy interesante que surgió en el proceso de la construcción del plan, que es interconectar todas las áreas silvestres de Paraguay a través de los recursos hídricos, a través de los bosques protectores de cauces hídricos. Y ya tenemos un primer mapa de áreas prioritarias para la restauración, que son las áreas silvestres protegidas interconectadas a través de los bosques protectores de cauces hídricos. Estamos terminando el plan y dijimos, ok, ¿qué más podemos hacer? Y retomando un poco el acuerdo que teníamos con la World Resource Institute y el trabajo que venimos haciendo también con la Global Forest Watch, porque empezamos también ya en el año 2019 a trabajar con las alertas tempranas de la Global Forest Watch. Hicimos un trabajo de priorización de las alertas, cruzamos con nuestra capa de cobertura forestal para poder tener realmente las alertas priorizadas que ocurren en la zona boscosa nativa de nuestro país y así poder tener una rápida intervención y una rápida llegada a terreno. Dijimos, pongamos toda esta información en un visor y que pueda ser visto no solamente aquí en Paraguay, sino que a nivel mundial. Entonces, empezamos a ver todos los visores que se nos imaginaban que habían de los diferentes países y comenzamos a decir, bueno, me gusta esto que tiene este visor de Perú, me gusta esto que tiene el visor de Chile, y empezamos a construir el visor de bosques de Paraguay. Este visor va a ser lanzado en finales de septiembre, probablemente, en Paraguay, y es un visor que contiene toda la información de cambio de uso de la tierra, cobertura forestal, plantaciones forestales, bosques en comunidades indígenas, cambio de uso de la tierra desde el año, ahora tenemos desde el año 2017, pero tenemos la información desde el año 2000. Y voy a esto porque todo esto lo hicimos antes de que la Unión Europea saque su reglamentación. Entonces, nosotros no estamos haciendo esto por una reglamentación, estamos haciendo esto porque entendemos como país que tenemos la gran responsabilidad de desarrollarnos mucho más sosteniblemente que otros países, ¿ok? Lo había mencionado Astrid, hubieron un montón de países que no lo hicieron en su momento y hoy nosotros tenemos la responsabilidad y entendemos que tenemos la responsabilidad de desarrollarnos mucho más sostenible de lo que lo hicieron otros países. Y la clave para todo este trabajo, los key points para estos 3 trabajos fueron tecnología, datos y personas.
Yes. Well, persons are always crucial. Leadership is crucial, but it's really amazing to hear you speak about how what gets measured gets managed, which is what you are showing. And we need the right data to be able to get to the right assessment of what is needed. And you outlined also how this is now going to lead to your national restoration plan, which is amazing. But you also point to the fact that this actually, that the European legislation, it wasn't the driver for you to do this, but it does create a market. And to have those markets is, of course, absolutely crucial to make sure that it doesn't just make sense for the climate or for nature, but that it makes sense for people, because smallholder farmers need to make their living. Well, you're sitting next to somebody who's representing one of the other biggest markets in the world, so he may feel where this is going to. You may get a sense of where this is going to. So Daniel Candy, Director of Sustainable Landscapes in the US State Department, reflecting on what was also just said by the speaker. How do you see the US in this landscape of supply chains? Let me phrase it a little bit openly. I come from politics myself before I joined the World Resources Institute, so I know that politics is a complex environment to navigate, and yet leadership, personal leadership, is often key in change, and politics does play an important role in change. From the situation of the United States, from the perception of the United States, looking at supply chains, looking at the way in which we could jointly transform how they function. Can you outline a little bit where the US stands at this moment, what the executive and the legislative can do, and what kind of support potentially the US could bring to producing countries that are actually looking for those opportunities in new markets to start producing in a different way? Please, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Before I start, I have to admit that Tina's noticed that I didn't have headphones here, and I'm sitting here politely nodding as though I understand everything. I took Spanish for 4 years in high school, so I caught a little bit. But really appreciated the opening remarks and a bit of an explanation from Astrid Schumacher on where the EU is at this moment. And I appreciate the diplomatically phrased question. So the US recognizes that agriculture is the major global driver of land conversion and forest loss, and that a lot of that land conversion is tied to agricultural products that end up in international markets, and that the US is, as you said, one of the major global markets, and products connected to deforestation will end up in the EU. In terms of political leadership, President Biden, more than I think any other president, frankly, has demonstrated leadership on climate and forests. He's committed to support global efforts to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030, endorse the Glasgow Leaders Declaration, and so working to address forest loss tied to land conversion, agricultural commodity production, is necessarily a part of the president's agenda and our government's focus. Last year on Earth Day, President Biden mandated that the State Department, along with other relevant agencies, draft a set of reports, essentially evaluating options for a whole-of-government approach to addressing international deforestation, including international deforestation connected to agricultural supply chains. So that drafting process brought together a number of different agencies to consider and assess what options might be available to us. And we really started from a premise that there are a range of options. There are, technical cooperation, supply-side approaches to essentially support countries who produce agricultural commodities, to produce those in a way that's sustainable, deforestation-free, and prevents those commodities from entering the market in the first place. And then also demand-side measures like the EU has taken. And historically, the US has experience with demand-side measures, specifically to address illegal logging through the Lacey Act, which many of you are probably familiar with. And so when we were assessing these kind of demand-side measures and the implications for the US in implementing, monitoring, enforcing, et cetera, we took a lot of lessons from that experience. And I think one of the key lessons or takeaways from the more than decade process of elaborating, implementing, and enforcing the Lacey Act and our other kind of broad range of efforts to address international deforestation informed us that demand-side measures are enormously complex. I think that our colleagues from the EU would acknowledge this. They're complex politically, economically, technically, particularly relevant for the Land and Carbon Lab Summit, really complex from a data standpoint as well. And one of the issues that we discussed at great length was this issue of data. I realize now I'm on stage representing the US. I'm originally from Australia. I should be saying data, and I don't know if...
You're welcome in any form of English.
Okay,
this
great.
stage,
I'll see how I do. So we start to think about questions of data. I can't do it. What data and information would be necessary to demonstrate the commodities weren't tied to land that was cleared illegally? So kind of, you know, this legal approach, or what kind of data would be needed to assess whether commodities were produced after a cutoff date, like the EU's approach? Is the data available? Is it at a sufficient resolution to be able to make that assessment? Are there privacy concerns associated with that data? How would you assess due diligence or due care on the basis of that data under either a legality framework or a cutoff date framework? The costs associated with that data, the costs to the producer, to the importer, to the consumer, and, you know, from an equity perspective, it was mentioned this issue of smallholders, but how are we making sure that data requirements don't unfairly burden producers and essentially act as a kind of restriction or blockage to market access and undo some of the development gains in countries where populations, frankly, you know, rely on access to these markets. So the process of drafting this report, which was supposed to make recommendations on what the US would do or might do to address these issues, really generated a set of additional questions and work. And I think there's probably, I know there's disappointment from a lot of people, including probably in this audience, who want to see the US directly follow the EU's lead and implement a similar or exactly the same demand-side regulation. But I think from the US process and how we approach policy making, if we're considering questions around equity, sustainable development, environmental justice, avoiding unintended consequences, it's not a bad thing to go through these processes and do your homework. Candidly, getting all of the agencies to the table to even engage in these questions represents a significant shift and is on the basis of political leadership from the president in this administration, who said that we will now start to consider issues of supply chains, international trade in the context of climate and deforestation. And that's never been done in the US administration. We've had comments from Trade Representative Tai, for example, acknowledging that trade liberalization can't be the only goal, the end goal. We have to do it in consideration of these other issues. So even though this process that we've been on has not yielded specific regulation, it has started this kind of set of conversations that do, I think, represent a sizable paradigm shift. I think it's also important to understand how our government works. A lot of you are probably American, some of you aren't, even the ones who are American. It's, I don't know, civics classes.
We know
how
government works.
But the president and the executive branch can take certain actions. The president can issue an executive order. they can instruct an agency to take further action on an existing regulation, or to clarify existing authorities and mandates toward a certain outcome, but they have to be existing authorities and mandates. The president can't unilaterally decide to regulate something. And so we're kind of in a different context in the EU Parliament, EU Commission, etc. Any regulation akin to the EU's regulation would have to be an act of Congress. A lot of you probably see American news. I'll let you decide for yourself the likelihood of that happening in the near term. I will say that there are some positive signs, though, in Congress. In 2021, Senator Schatz from Hawaii introduced the Forest Act, which would use, kind of similar to the Lacey Act or the UK legislation, to stop commodities produced illegally from entering US markets. It hasn't been reintroduced in this year's Congress, so it's not up for a vote, but maybe in the future that will be the case. And I think, as Astrid said, there is, all eyes on the EU to see how this regulation unfolds, its implications and outcomes, and that might help inform how Congress is addressing this issue and what kind of legislative approach, regulatory approach they might take, and also for the federal government, certainly, how we engage the issue and think about designing our own policy. So we appreciate, the EU taking this bold step and doing some of the homework maybe for us.
Just to make sure that we have enough time to go to the next speakers.
I just want to quickly mention that outside of, and in the absence of regulation, we do support, to your point, a number of outcomes and actions to address these issues. We're working with WRI on the Forest Data Partnership to help align consensus around key data sets, develop the open source validated data that companies and other actors in the supply chain need to be able to assess and make determinations about their procurement and where they're sourcing from. So we are involved in this space and will continue to do so even in the absence of regulation.
Thank you so much. And of course, like I said, we understand the complexities of political landscapes and certainly recognize the importance of the leadership of somebody like President Biden to put this on the agenda, to start the discussion, which is always the first step, to get everybody to the table, to start recognizing that we really need to move beyond illegality, because legally produced products also lead to a lot of deforestation. And of course, if we think about costs, the more regulations around the world are aligned, lower additional costs are, right? So marginal costs are lower if the regulatory processes are more aligned. And in that sense, let's indeed hope that the test bed that the EU provides here will lead to swift take-up across other countries. Because I think if we look at the markets of the US and the EU combined, that could provide that real tipping point for markets worldwide, even more than just the EU, which is already setting a real market for production along new standards. Carol, if you don't mind, I'd like to go to Mr. Tidiane Sia first, so to hear from another producing country, and then I would love to hear from you, from the perspective of the European Parliament, what would be the next steps. So I'll just turn to French for Mr. Sia. Quel processus la Côte d'Ivoire a-t-elle déjà mis en place pour se préparer aux exigences du marché de l'Union européenne? Et comment sont-ils liés aux objectifs de la politique nationale de la Côte d'Ivoire? Et qu'est-ce que nous pouvons apprendre des efforts passés des pays producteurs pour réglementer le bois et garantir la production légale et durable, hein, comme Mme Schumacher a dit, hein, on est au début, on a déjà fait beaucoup d'efforts. Comment la Côte d'Ivoire applique-t-elle ces leçons à la chaîne d'approvisionnement du cacao? Et quelles seraient par exemple aussi les mesures d'appui qui seraient essentielles pour assurer que les producteurs dans la Côte d'Ivoire pourraient effectivement produire dans le contexte maintenant mis en place par l'Union européenne? La parole est à vous.
Merci. Je vais d'abord commencer donc, par notre expérience en matière de respect du règlement bois de l'Union européenne. Donc, il faut noter qu'en Côte d'Ivoire, à partir des années 2010, donc, le gouvernement a déjà initié la délimitation numérique des concessions d'exploitation forestière Et à partir des années 2012-2013, nous avons donc initié l'utilisation des coordonnées géographiques dans le suivi de l'exploitation forestière. Et après cela, avec l'entrée en vigueur du règlement bois de l'Union européenne, les opérateurs donc, ont commencé à se conformer aux exigences de ce règlement. Ce qu'il faut noter particulièrement dans le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, c'est que ce processus s'est mis en place de manière progressive. Donc les 3 premières années, au niveau du secteur forestier, nous avons enregistré une diversité, une disparité dans les demandes d'information au niveau des importateurs. Mais rapidement, au bout de la 3e année, ce processus est standardisé. Cela a pu être possible donc, par rapport à un certain nombre d'actions qui ont été menées. Donc les actions d'information, de communication, d'accompagnement vis-à-vis donc, des entreprises. C'est vrai que les exigences de diligence raisonnée donc, incombent aux importateurs européens, mais il est important de savoir que la mise en œuvre concrète des activités sur le terrain se fait par les acteurs qui interviennent au niveau local. Donc ces acteurs-là sont extrêmement importants et dans toutes les discussions qui se font, il est extrêmement important de pouvoir identifier leurs besoins et apporter des éléments de solutions concrètes par rapport à ces besoins-là. Et donc, au final, donc, par rapport au règlement bois de l'Union européenne, le secteur privé ivoirien a pu faire élaborer donc, une liste standard donc, de documents donc, qui pourraient être utilisés dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre donc, des exigences de ce règlement bois de l'Union européenne. Alors, pour en revenir à la situation de la Côte d'Ivoire elle-même, juste pour revenir sur cette liste standard de documents donc, comportait un certain nombre d'informations liées à la légalité des opérateurs, à la légalité des produits, sur les dimensions économiques, environnementales et sociales, et même aussi au respect des procédures par l'administration. Donc, c'est extrêmement important. Dans le cadre de la Côte d'Ivoire, en ce qui concerne la politique forestière elle-même, il faut noter que la Côte d'Ivoire met en œuvre depuis 2019 une stratégie de préservation, de réhabilitation et d'extension des forêts, donc avec pour objectif de réduire la déforestation dans notre pays, mais aussi d'accroître la superficie forestière donc à hauteur de 20% du territoire à l'horizon 2030. Et spécifiquement par rapport à la filière bois, la Côte d'Ivoire s'est engagée donc, dans un processus de négociation d'un accord de partenariat volontaire FLECT avec l'Union européenne depuis 2013. Et cet accord, les négociations ont été conclues par rapport à cet accord-là. L'accord a été paraphé par le ministre des Eaux et Forêts de la Côte d'Ivoire et le directeur général des partenariats internationaux de la Commission européenne en octobre 2022. Et cet accord est programmé pour être signé au cours de cette année 2023. Alors, spécifiquement par rapport à l'APV, ce qu'il est important de noter, d'abord, première chose, la valeur ajoutée des APV est reconnue dans ce nouveau règlement. Dans ce nouveau règlement, en termes d'apport, en ce qui concerne l'amélioration de la gouvernance forestière, mais aussi les acquis en matière d'exigences légales et de traçabilité du bois. Donc ça, c'est clairement dit dans ce nouveau règlement et je pense que cela a été dit, c'est l'un des éléments sur lesquels il va falloir plutôt capitaliser par rapport à l'expérience de la filière bois. Alors spécifiquement par rapport donc, à la Côte d'Ivoire, il faut noter que la Côte d'Ivoire est concernée par 5 des 7 produits ciblés dans ce règlement. Donc le cacao, le café, l'EVA, le bois. Et parmi ces 5 produits, on a l'avantage d'avoir plus d'une dizaine d'expériences donc de diligence raisonnée pour les entreprises du secteur bois par rapport à la réglementation bois de l'Union européenne. Donc l'APV, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, a permis d'accroître donc les actions d'amélioration de la gouvernance forestière puisque nous avons pu mettre en place un cadre de participation donc, qui a permis de mobiliser l'ensemble des acteurs pertinents dans les questions de gouvernance forestière dans notre pays, dont les administrations concernées, donc les organisations de la société civile, le secteur privé et la société civile. Et certains de ces acteurs ont pu, donc, du fait de cette structuration-là, intervenir de façon plus efficace sur d'autres thématiques, notamment la thématique du cacao. Donc, ça a été le cas pour la société civile, donc, qui a emmagasiné des expériences dans le cadre de l'APV et pouvoir intervenir de façon plus efficace sur les discussions dans le cadre du cacao. L'accord de partenariat volontaire FLECT en Côte d'Ivoire a aussi donc, accéléré le processus de réforme donc légale et réglementaire. C'est extrêmement important. On parle beaucoup de légalité, mais pour pouvoir assurer la vérification de la légalité, il faut bien entendu avoir un dispositif juridique robuste. Et donc ça a été un élément qui a été fait dans le cadre de la Côte d'Ivoire avec une accélération apportée dans le cadre du processus APV-FLET. Aujourd'hui, nous avons un code forestier et plus d'une quarantaine de tests d'application. Donc la base est déjà fixée pour pouvoir réussir cette vérification de la légalité. Élément extrêmement important aussi, l'accord de partenariat volontaire nous a permis donc de développer un système de vérification de la légalité et de traçabilité du bois dans un processus multipartite avec une forte implication du secteur privé. Parce qu'au final, cette vérification va se faire sur les acteurs du secteur privé. Et dans le cas spécifique de la Côte d'Ivoire, donc, nous avons des outils pratiques qui ont été développés, donc, qui sont des grilles de légalité, donc, qui concernent les différentes catégories d'opérateurs que nous avons dans notre pays. L'APV a eu l'avantage de circonscrire donc, le périmètre de vérification de la légalité. Le règlement nous dit que la vérification de la légalité doit se faire sur la base des réglementations pertinentes pour le pays. Et je pense que déjà, ça, c'est un des acquis de l'APV parce que cette base a été fixée. Quelles sont les dispositions pertinentes en matière économique, environnementale et sociale, donc qui doivent être prises en compte. Donc ça, c'est les éléments qui ont été documentés. Et aussi, il y a les questions de transparence dans le secteur forestier, donc qui ont été également abordées. Alors, les défis qui nous restent, c'est vraiment de pouvoir opérationnaliser dans le meilleur délai ces systèmes, compte tenu des délais qui nous ont été annoncés. 18 mois, 24 mois, c'est déjà demain.
C'est demain.
Et je pense que nous avons un énorme défi donc, pour opérationnaliser tous ces systèmes donc, qui vont au final nous permettre de pouvoir répondre aux exigences de légalité et de traçabilité des produits. Un élément important, donc, nous allons aussi, donc, dans le cadre de la Côte d'Ivoire, essayer de prouver dans le cadre du dialogue avec la partie européenne que les éléments de durabilité sont pris en compte aussi. Parce que le message qu'il faut faire passer, à notre avis, c'est que si les éléments de durabilité sont pris en compte dans la législation nationale, automatiquement, je pense que tous les bois qui seront couverts par un régime d'autorisation FLEC pourront non seulement respecter les exigences de légalité et de traçabilité, mais aussi sont conformes aux exigences de durabilité, étant donné que si on peut prouver par après que ces bois ont été récoltés dans un espace qui n'a pas fait l'objet de déforestation. Le deuxième défi important, c'est les questions de vulgarisation de tous les dispositifs légaux et réglementaires. Comme je l'ai dit, dans le cadre de la Côte d'Ivoire, aujourd'hui, nous avons fini la phase d'élaboration. Le dispositif est existant et le défi, c'est l'application pratique des mesures sur le terrain. Et cela nécessite des accompagnements vis-à-vis des acteurs. Les acteurs méritent d'être accompagnés parce qu'il y a des nouvelles normes de gestion durable donc, qui ont été mises en place et il faut que ces actions-là soient effectivement appliquées sur le terrain. Donc, ça nécessite des appuis, des accompagnements. Et ça, c'est des initiatives qui sont spécifiques à chaque commodité. La chaîne d'approvisionnement du bois est différente de la chaîne d'approvisionnement du cacao, de l'EVA, ainsi de suite. Et donc, les appuis spécifiques de la chaîne d'approvisionnement du bois ne peuvent pas être dupliqués sans adaptation dans les autres chaînes d'approvisionnement. Alors, en termes de leçons tirées, je vais terminer sur cela. Il est reconnu, je pense que le règlement le mentionne, et les expériences en Côte d'Ivoire et dans les autres pays ont pu permettre de noter la robustesse des instruments développés dans le cadre des APV. Mais toutefois, je pense que pour disposer de ces outils-là, le temps nécessaire et l'approche qui a été mise en œuvre, parce que c'est un accord qui a été négocié, donc sur la base d'une feuille de route, est extrêmement long par rapport au délai donc, qui se présente à nous, 18-24 mois, par rapport au respect des exigences. Donc, il est évident qu'une réflexion doit être menée pour savoir comment on peut adapter donc, ces outils-là dans le cadre des autres commodités. Il a été dit, la légalité et la durabilité, oui, mais ça a un coût et ça nécessite des appuis. Et le deuxième enseignement qu'on tire, c'est que c'est un processus qui nécessite énormément de ressources. Des ressources financières, des ressources humaines et des ressources techniques. Donc, c'est des éléments à mettre en œuvre et il est important que les différents pays producteurs, comme la Côte d'Ivoire, dans le cadre de coopération avec l'Union européenne, puissent, au-delà de se fixer des exigences du respect de ces réglementations, puissent travailler ensemble dans le cadre de coopération donc pour adresser les défis spécifiques des acteurs, mais je vais parler des acteurs du terrain. Je vous remercie.
Je vous remercie beaucoup, beaucoup, beaucoup. Je pense que c'est très clair. So I'm going to switch to English again now. So, Carl, producing countries that see this regulation as an opportunity to comply actually with what they also want nationally, or where they see opportunities for better management and protection of their own beautiful country. Yet the delay is very short. The time is very short, and both the administrative system, but also the specific support to specific supply chains and specific farmers for specific commodities in different countries, it's quite a challenge. So my question to you would actually be, 18 months on the clock, what should be the next steps?
Yeah. Hello, good morning, everybody. So this is a very fair question, and this is one of the main questions we have been asking also in the European Parliament when we were negotiating with the Council this legislation. And just on a more general note, I wanted to say that this regulation will maybe be one of the legislation that will be the most remembered during this term as being the most transformative of all the legislation we have passed under the Green Deal, because it will have a direct impact on supply chains, a direct impact on economic operator, and a direct impact on partner countries. And this is where what you have mentioned and what the other panelists of Ivory Coast have just mentioned, that they need time to get adapted. And to put it simply, this is also what we were looking for when legislating on this piece of legislation, is that we wanted to make a difference for real and to have an impact on the balance of power within one supply chain. And it's very striking to see that at the beginning of the negotiation, all the big agri-food industry was telling us, okay, this is a very good idea, thanks for that. But the main issue we have now is that Cargill, Bunge, etc., are not transparent enough, and we have not the means to ask them to be transparent and to ensure us that we are deforestation free. And one of the objectives of this legislation is to have an impact in those negotiations that are happening between the Cargills and the Danones and the Unilever of the world, making business in the EU, of course, so that they have a bit of a upper hand against the big trader. And this is exactly what is already happening. So this is one of the theory change that was behind this legislation and that we have pushed forward, and why we are so proud of this legislation having been passed. So now for the next steps, it is clear that the biggest challenge is manifold. The first one is how to ensure that the EU, and especially the European Commission, because you, Astrid and her team, are the one having the money and all the means to engage with third country so that they can develop deforestation-free supply chain. This is the absolutely emergency, and this is the task of the next months. It has already started. Like a few months ago, President Macron and other head of state were in Gabon specifically to discuss this topic and to try to see how those deforestation-free supply chains can be spread and developed in Africa and in Latin America. So it shows that things are in motions. Then for the next steps, I think we have to bear in mind that this legislation will be extremely impactful, but is not comprehensive yet. What is not comprehensive yet, but will be a bit more in the months to come, are first, what are the other area at risk of deforestation that should be covered by this legislation? And this was one of the biggest fights of the European Parliament in the negotiation. It was to try to cover other ecosystems, including other wooded land, and including the Cerrado area, which is for the EU where we have the most impact in terms of deforestation in the world right now. So starting from yesterday, you have 1 year now, the Commission, to develop this, and I think it would be one of the most impactful things to do before the implementation of this legislation. Then what is also necessary is to address the other driver of deforestation. Indeed, agriculture, as you have mentioned, Daniel, is the main driver of deforestation so far. And the economic operator are the one that have an impact on agriculture. But it's hard to explain why we are asking the big agri-food industry to follow a due diligence system but at the same time, we have some financial institutions that are still able to finance some development project in Brazil, in Indonesia, to agriculture project that can drive to deforestation. So there is a little bit of discrepancy here. It's once again good that the Commission is working on it, even though during the negotiation, the Commission was a bit reluctant to go down that line, but I'm happy that now things are in motion. So those are the two first priority, according to us, for the next months. Then implementation, and also for the sake of clarity, level playing field, and to show that there is a precedent effect. I think it's excellent that the US are also maybe not walking exactly along the same line than the EU, but at least considering it. And we have been in touch with many US lawmakers during the negotiation of this law, and it is true that we see a willingness to advance. And it shows that the will to connect the trade rules of the EU, but also of other countries, with our environmental and climate rules is shared among the key market of the world. And this is what can have a huge impact in producer country and can also trigger a huge interest of those markets to help the producer country to get aligned with the necessity to have deforestation-free supply chain. And this connection between the trade rules and the environmental rules is really what makes this legislation so radical, actually. Because a few years ago, it would have not been possible to think about it at all. No, we were just saying, okay, legality is already excellent, and there is no connection possible with trade on one side and climate and environmental action on the other side. Now, and this is what makes the EU a green market and a green superpower right now, is exactly this connection, and this is what makes a huge difference. So, according to us, this piece of legislation will be one of the landmark legislation of this legislation. It will be one of the biggest contribution of the EU to the objective of the coming Montreal Agreement. Of course, it's not the only one. And if we have been able to pass this legislation last year and to have a wide majority in favor of it, we can see that nature and biodiversity protection within the EU is more and more questioned. And if we want the show to go on, we have to keep fighting for this, keep working with key businesses that shows that economic-wise it is possible, feasible, that they have the financial means to deliver. And this is what we are doing right now in the Parliament, and this is one of the hottest topics right now. So thanks a lot, and good luck for the work and the rest of the lab. Bye.
Thank you so much, Carl. Thank you so much. And indeed, the fight is still on, right? And continuing. And we all wish you, of course, every success, as it's a fight for the future of our planet, which is all of our homes. You already outlined basically future ambitions, right? And I think yesterday we saw that with the new data of the Land and Carbon Lab, other wooded land can actually be tracked very effectively too. Every tree, the growth of every tree, or the absence of trees. So I think here again, I think the data can help to make sure that this kind of legislation actually becomes practically possible and actually reflects what happens on the ground, what was Christina was referring to. And it's wonderful to see all of those ambitions coming together. At the same time, we have to make sure that we find ways to support the producing countries in actually meeting these challenges, as was outlined as well. We have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. And if I'm correct, then there is a wonderful app which is called Slido. And perhaps we can put a little bit of a... this is a test, right? So it's working. And there is a question. What measures the EU Commission is taking to prevent two-tier supply chains, one deforestation-free to Europe, and the other to less connected markets. I would say, Carl, that perhaps this is speaking from the ideal that we would love to have one set of trade rules across the world, which we just heard is something we might hope for, but may not be imminent tomorrow. I would love for both of you to reflect on that a little bit, but Carl, first to you.
Okay, thank you. So I think it's more a question for the Commission and Astrid, but in any case, let's say that the bet of this legislation is to say that the economic interest of economic operator is to increase the sustainability of their supply chain and to avoid having multiple segregated supply chains, but having as less as possible that are aligned with the standards of the EU. And this is actually what we are trying to do in many other legislation, and this is linked to the fact that we want to use the single market of the EU as a tool to leverage upward the standards in the world. If you take the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, or also the reciprocity clause when it comes to the use of certain pesticides, this is exactly what we want to do. And we are not looking for a segregated supply chain world, but rather to have economic operators say, okay, it is too costly for me to have two segregated supply chains, so I make only one that can go to the EU and to the other part of the world. And actually, when you talk to big companies and operators like the Cargills and likes, this is more or less what they are telling you in between the line, of course.
And we've seen this before, of course, with other product regulation that the EU has put in place, the so-called Brussels effect that Astrid was referring to earlier. And of course, there's countries that are all actively looking for markets that have these rules because it provides a different market to compete on. Anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, I just want to come in and say we were concerned about this issue as well. I think, you know, just in the abstract, it makes sense. Or you can see this as a potential outcome, that you have this bifurcated market where the EU or other countries have this very potentially costly regulation, and so products go elsewhere. I was looking at the numbers last night. 60% of global soy produced goes to China, 8% goes to the EU, 20%, I think it is, of global palm oil goes to India, about 18% to China, 10% to the EU, 4% to the US. So this issue is very real. I think the other thing that we took into account in thinking about addressing the issue of commodity-driven deforestation, not just in the context of international trade, but the fact that a lot of the commodities produced remain in domestic markets. And so it's insufficient to do this only in the context of international trade and demand, but working on the ground to change production approaches to make them deforestation-free and sustainable is also very critical. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
Well, with being a front runner, of course, always means that you're a little bit ahead of the rest, right? But it also means that Europe plays that role as a motor for change elsewhere. And I think we're all looking forward to seeing that happening. And of course, to see also this being a backbone, a support also to countries that want to protect their beautiful country and see that there's a market that helps them do just that. Let's see if there are other questions. I don't see them on the Slido yet, but I do see, I can't see them here. Let me check my phone. If somebody has sent me some, otherwise we will go to the, I will see if somebody can step up to the microphone. Please, if you could come forward to the microphone. Oh, perfect. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, Benji Jones with Vox. I guess my question is similar to the last one. It seems unimaginable to stop deforestation in the tropics without addressing demand side in China and India. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to negotiations or conversations that you've had with those country leaders to address similar demand side regulations in those countries.
That may be a question that I would ask Mrs. Schomaker to respond to later. She's coming back for some remarks. I would doubt it's in the responsibility of the people here on the panel beyond what has already been said. Unless any of you would like to. Yes, please, Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe just to quickly point out that in the U.S.-China joint statement that came out during COP26 in Glasgow. One of the areas for bilateral cooperation and work between the US and China was on illegal forest products, and China's been elaborating their regulation and updating their national forest law, which is ostensibly supposed to prevent import of illegal timber products. We want to have some dialogue with China on that issue. And there was perhaps a hope that that would encourage or lead to broader discussions about these international trade and supply chain issues related to deforestation. So that's certainly on the table, although obviously, you know, a very, very challenging set of engagements between the US, China, and other countries on that topic. But definitely something that's you know, on our mind.
And of course, also at the Gabon summit that you just mentioned, this was also very much on the agenda and discussed amongst a number of countries. There's three questions actually here in front. So I'll go to the lady in red, ladies first, and then to the gentleman sitting next to her.
Thank you very much, Nicole from Fern Forest and Rights organization in Brussels. I'd like to ask the colleagues from the partner countries. At this stage, we've heard that there is the regulation entering into application soon. We've heard the Commission talk about the strategic framework for cooperation. European Union countries have put a Team Europe initiative on the way. But what would you ideally like to see in partnerships offered by the European Union to attack the root causes of deforestation?
Please. Who would like to take the floor on this from the producing countries? Did you catch the question? Would you like a short?
No, don't worry.
Yes?
I understand, but I'm going to speak in Spanish.
Yes, you can always speak in Spanish because the translation is there.
Thank you. Justamente estos días estábamos conversando sobre que la Unión Europea tiene mucha cooperación también en países que son países productores de alimentos. En Paraguay estamos trabajando hoy con un proyecto que se llama Forest for Life, que es un proyecto enfocado a tener una rápida respuesta a los incendios forestales. En el año 2019 en Paraguay, después de más de 20 años, tuvimos unos grandes incendios forestales que ingresaron desde Bolivia en el Chaco paraguayo. Entonces es una de las líneas de trabajo que estamos trabajando con la cooperación europea. Yo creo que probablemente puedan haber más líneas de cooperación, pero como había comentado al comienzo, creo que esas líneas tienen que enfocarse en generar datos, en poder estandarizar esos datos y en poder trabajar con los países, con el sector privado, que en el caso de Paraguay, como había mencionado al comienzo, el sector privado es dueño de más del 80% de la superficie boscosa del Paraguay y son los mayores responsables de la conservación de esos bosques. Entonces, creo que eso es un punto que la cooperación de Unión Europea tiene que trabajar. Tenerle también al sector privado sentado en la mesa a la hora de hablar de proyectos de cooperación, principalmente en los países productores de alimentos. En el caso de Paraguay, como le dije, y todas estas reglamentaciones no se dan por la reglamentación de la Unión Europea, sino que son reglamentaciones que tenemos desde mucho antes. En la región oriental de Paraguay tenemos una ley de deforestación cero desde el año 2004. Es decir, más del 90% de la soja que produce Paraguay proviene de áreas que no fueron deforestadas desde el año 2004. Entonces, para nosotros es una gran oportunidad, es un challenge la reglamentación, pero es importante que la cooperación le tenga al sector privado en la mesa a la hora de formular también los proyectos.
Thank you so much. I had promised to come to the gentleman and he was waiting patiently, and then I will go to the chat because I see some questions have hands up and I'll be democratic about it, so I'll start raising the questions that have most of the hands up on the chat. So please find your way to Slido if you want to contribute to the discussion. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm Glauco from the Mission of Brazil to the EU, Agriculture Attaché. I'd like to ask about the nature restoration law that we saw that's kind of going to reject, and if it's not like a contradiction that we see with the UDR, and when you put that the restoration is so important than of keep the forest. So what can you see, what can you read about this action that the European Union is doing? It's some kind of, the rules are good outside of here, but not here. It's something like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Carl, please.
Okay, I think I can answer this very quickly. So I don't think this is the opposition, to be honest and intellectually honest, the opposition of certain political group in the European Parliament to the nature restoration law is not contradictory with what we are doing with the EU DR. It's not very consistent, but it's not contradictory. Why? Because the beauty of the EU DR is that it applies to partner countries, but it applies in the same way to the EU. And this is why this is this is not a protectionist tool. It will apply to forests in Romania and Sweden that are, for some of them, heavily degraded, but also to the same degraded forest in Côte d'Ivoire or Indonesia, etc. So at least on this, I think that the EUDR, it is a clean tool for that. But of course, the EU nature restoration law is another story. It will be an additional contribution to the commitment that the EU have taken to fulfill the COP15 commitment. That is for sure. But I don't see it contradictory with the legislation. I see it as a missing opportunity to fulfill our international commitment. That is for sure.
Thank you so much. And I see that there's two clear winners in the chat. The first question, I would like to invite Astrid to respond to that, which is, will the EU Observatory provide a reference map of FAO forests as of the end of 2020, the cutoff date, to be used by operators and competent authorities? I think this came back also to the question that was raised earlier. How can we help standardizing? How can we help making it easier for countries to comply? The second question that has a lot of hands up, I'd like to go to Côte d'Ivoire. Est-ce que la Côte d'Ivoire va soutenir la collection de data géospatiale par un système national, ou est-ce que ça va être purement quelque chose qui doit être fait par le secteur privé?
Merci pour la question. Je pense que cette question nous donne l'opportunité de dire ce qui est déjà fait dans le cadre des actions menées par le gouvernement pour se conformer aux exigences de ces règlements. Tout à l'heure, j'ai partagé l'expérience de la filière bois. Alors, ce qu'il faut noter, c'est que pour la filière cacao, le gouvernement de Côte d'Ivoire met en œuvre donc, une stratégie nationale sur le cacao durable, donc, qui a été adoptée en mars 2022 et donc, qui vise à lutter contre la déforestation, donc améliorer le revenu des producteurs, mais aussi à lutter contre le travail des enfants. Donc, il y a 3 objectifs fondamentaux dans cette stratégie. Et dans le cadre de cette stratégie, il y a 3 systèmes majeurs donc, qui seront opérationnalisés. Le premier système, c'est le système de suivi des forêts et d'alerte précoce à la déforestation. Donc, ce système-là, le cahier des charges est déjà élaboré. Et à l'instar de ce que nous avons dit pour la filière bois, il faut aller très vite à l'opérationnalisation de ce système-là, donc qui va permettre de disposer des données nationales fiables. Mais je pense que dans tout ce processus, la Côte d'Ivoire est ouverte donc, aux échanges avec les différents acteurs. Hier, nous avons pu voir les présentations donc, sur l'état du suivi des forêts des différents pays. J'ai pu moi-même consulter les données aussi par rapport à la Côte d'Ivoire. Et tous ces éléments doivent être mis ensemble pour effectivement pouvoir aider à la prise de décision. Deuxième élément important, c'est que la Côte d'Ivoire a déjà élaboré la carte d'occupation des sols pour l'année de référence. Donc ce document est élaboré et donc est dans un processus de validation et va servir de base par rapport à toutes les actions de déforestation. Je pense qu'il est extrêmement important, comme on l'a dit, de maintenir le dialogue et la coopération dans l'analyse des données. Vous voyez, la définition de la forêt de la Côte d'Ivoire est différente donc, de la définition de la forêt de la FAO qui est retenue dans cette nouvelle législation. Et donc, ce sera un certain nombre d'arbitrages qui vont être faits pour effectivement suivre le monitoring par rapport aux actions de déforestation qui pourraient éventuellement être mentionnées ça et là. Donc, voilà un peu les différents systèmes. Le troisième système, c'est le système de l'observation du travail des enfants qui est en cours d'élaboration. Et donc, l'action de mise en œuvre de cette stratégie nationale cacao du Jura va se poursuivre. Et c'est au plus haut niveau de l'État que cette stratégie est mise en œuvre et est extrêmement importante pour le pays.
Merci beaucoup. Je vous remercie beaucoup. I want to thank all of you for participating actively. We have run out of time, but I did find it important to have a couple of questions from the audience. We will make sure that all your questions are also referred to the speakers and to the European Commission so that they may be in contact with you maybe after the end of this session. We were all asked to make sure that the high-level panels would end on time, so without much further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Astrid Schomacher for her final reflections. But please, a warm round of applause for all our members of the panel. Thank you so much for being with us. You can stand here if you want.
At least I'm reunited with my pen. That's
yes, I was going to say.
No, I mean, very quickly, I think there were lots of super interesting questions. One that I actually can not answer, and if I can, the answer might be on my phone, and I left my phone down there, and that is the very precise question on what the JSC Observatory, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission Observatory, will provide. I mean, we are working with them to make sure that the maximum of information is there and that the information is really helpful. I recognize the value of such a reference map. I cannot guarantee that we will have it, but I think certainly we understand why that's important, and that's what we're working towards. I think another sort of questions that was super important was this, how do we make sure not to have this two-tier system? And I tried to answer a little bit, and also Kai, I think, spoke to that. I think that is absolutely, absolutely crucial. And the trade figures that Daniel mentioned, of course, explain that the EU market isn't huge, and in fact it's shrinking, globally speaking, but it is still an important market, and we have seen this sort of pull effect of the market. But this will not be enough, I think, to just rely on the fact that we have this effect. So we need to spend a lot more time, and we are spending a lot of time engaging with third countries. And a few of them were mentioned. So my commissioner, for example, is traveling to India for the India's the G20 presidency. So at the end of July, the commissioner will be traveling there. We will be raising deforestation again. We have raised that in bilateral contacts at ministerial level before, and we have asked India to consider its practices. We do the same for China. Again, the commissioner is going there in September. The vice president is going to be there next week. Deforestation is always on the agenda. We have a good engagement with China, something called the BCM. It's our bilateral cooperation mechanism that looks at at illegal logging, but we are now asking China to expand this and to look at its role as a major consumer, as the major consumer. I'm sort of hopeful because, I mean, China is the co-president. China was the country that brought us to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and that framework reaffirms the need to protect our forests. So China, as co-president, I think will also see its own responsibility there. And I was also very encouraged meeting with the FAO recently, which, by the way, has a Chinese director for forests, who was saying, actually, it is in China, there's a lot of different thinking now, and it's Chinese companies that are starting to say, even our consumer, not even, our consumers as well, are now interested in sustainability, and he believes that Chinese companies will change their sourcing practices. So I think there's a lot of encouraging work going on there. Of course, the Gabon summit was mentioned. Maybe also to say the WTO has a role to play, and we have a very green-minded WTO president. So I think at the moment, yes, not so much is happening, but 5 years ago, we also could not have imagined that we have a deforestation law in the European Union. So if we fast forward in 3, 4, 5 years, I think we will see a different landscape, and we will see others come in. And I wanted to particularly comment on what Daniel was saying, because I think indeed there is a lot of thought process going on in the US, and working in a big administration myself, I can appreciate that what it means to bring all actors together. It may sound small, but it is actually a very important first step. And I also want to mention the state of New York, that is just looking at legislation, looking at its public procurement, and it has a list of commodities, which is almost identical to the EU list of commodities, which the state of New York says it will no longer source from third countries unless they are proven to be deforestation free. So I think that is also an interesting thing to observe in the US. There are many actors, and very often some states take the lead, and when states take the lead, at some point the federal system follows. So I think I would dare say watch this space. There's a lot to do, but also a lot for us to discuss a bit more and to exchange experience. Because when you say, Daniel, that your analysis is that this will the kind of EU rules would lead to a massive price increase or cost increase. We have done, of course, the same assessment, and we arrived at a different conclusion. So it would be interesting to understand why we have this different perception there. Then also to say to Christina, I think it is super important and impressive what Paraguay has been doing. I think what is interesting here is how these things work together. You're doing it independent of the EU regulation, which is in fact much better. But on the other hand, I think this regulation then provides another policy push. And I think now for you to be able to roll out the analysis and translate that into practicality, i.e. into a supply chain that can make sure that what your analysis provided to say these are forests that have to be protected are in fact protected is, I think, where it becomes interesting and where we need to work together. On our colleague from Côte d'Ivoire, I mean, we recognize that Côte d'Ivoire is one of the countries that is most affected by our regulation. I think you mentioned 5 out of the 7 commodities you are producing and exporting to the European Union. There's an enormous amount of work going on in the country, and also between the EU and Côte d'Ivoire. For example, the COCOA dialogues, I think, are an extremely interesting model of multi-stakeholders coming together and also allowing us on the EU side to understand better what the challenges are and where to target our support. And that, of course, remains super important, that the EU is consistent in its external action. So we're putting out new rules with which the world has to comply if they want to put commodities on our markets. But at the same time, we're also a global actor, and I think the largest donor of aid. So, and we have committed 1 billion euros to forests in this financial period. So we need to make sure that our external action is coherent and that countries that are impacted by the regulation also get support. And the European Parliament has been pushing very strongly for that. And I mentioned the specific article in the regulation, which also asked us to come out with a strategy, which we're working on, which will not be a detailed strategy. We cannot have a strategy per country, because this is also rapidly moving, but it will at least hopefully assure everybody that we're bringing together all instruments at our disposal to try and engage with countries that need support. I just want to say, for the moment, this is very much a discussion between the EU and the third country, which is good and which it must be. But I mean, this summit also proves that there's a whole range of other actors that are basically standing ready to come and help. And there's WRI with its African offices and offices around the world. We have Bezos and NICFI here, and Bezos Fund has very deep pockets and has dedicated a lot of money to biodiversity conservation. So it is important, and that we haven't done so well yet, if I can say that we go beyond this mere bilateral conversation and see who else is there and how can we join forces and make sure that then the funds that are there are spent in sort of, not in parallel, but in a coordinated and most effective way. And maybe to conclude on a couple of other comments that Carl made in terms of this being a transformative piece of legislation, but not comprehensive. Yes, we can see that. I think probably everybody outside the EU and many inside the EU say we've already taken a huge bite at the cake. It is a big, and we have to swallow that thing, and we have to chew it first and then to swallow, and others, more importantly, also have to chew and swallow. So while it is very much on our radar screen, and I think I've explained that we need to maybe look at other ecosystems, or maybe we need to look at other ecosystems, we need to look at more commodities. I think we also need to start not small, but start realistic and do not bite off more than we can chew. And I think that's where we are. This displacement effect with our ecosystems we're quite aware of. We have a bit of a different assessment on the Cerrado that Carl mentioned. When we looked at it, and we looked at the forest definition, we were of the view that a large part of the Cerrado actually falls within the EU definition and therefore is protected. But okay, that's a matter for discussion, and I'm also not an expert there. And maybe lastly, to our colleague from Brazil, and the contradiction with the nature restoration law. So you said, is the EU in contradiction? No, the EU is not. So the European Commission, as you know, has made a proposal for nature restoration. All the member states have come together on a common position, which does not maintain all its features, but certainly maintains the idea of nature restoration law and the need for nature restoration. And we are, as you said, committed to that via the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The one thing I will say is that those that voted against the nature restoration law in the European Parliament actually say that they are not against nature restoration. And they very clearly said yesterday, well, we don't like the law, we don't like this proposal. They said, and I don't understand why or how, but they said this law does not actually enable the EU to fulfill its commitments under Kunming, and they basically seem to say we want a different law. But we still are very much committed to what we said in Montreal, and we want to live up to that. So I believe that is what the EU will do. So we will have a nature restoration law sooner or later. And certainly the EU will move ahead with nature restoration law because no matter what some interested parties may be seeing, nature restoration is not against food security, it is for food security, and it is about ensuring that our agricultural production can actually stand the test of time, including survive climate change. And therefore it's in our own best interest, and I think people tend to be structured in such a way that they act in their own interest, and we will do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid. My final comment, and then I would ask you to please rush to the next session so that we can also liberate this room. We are a little bit out of time. This is not a goal in itself. This is a tool. It's a tool to help us solve the biggest problems that humanity is facing at the moment. And for this tool, we need to be collaborative. We need to collaborate amongst ourselves here in Europe with the producing countries, but Astrid also very much welcomed your comment to see how can we join up forces more to make this tool a force for good. Much is needed, much support is needed, time is short. Let's collaborate, let's use this tool widely, let's protect our forest. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.